The music box was still playing when Lieutenant Marcel Beaumont found her. A thin, crystalline melody drifting through the skeletal remains of what had once been a village square in Alsace, eastern France, where the November wind carried the smell of wet ash and something darker, the sweet rot perfume of a place where too many people had died too quickly. Marcel had seen countless ruined villages in the 6 months since victory, but something about this one made him slow his jeep. Perhaps it was the absolute stillness. No scavenging dogs, no displaced families picking through rubble. Just silence and that impossible music. He followed the sound past a collapsed church, its stone saints now faceless and broken, past the burned husk of what might have been a bakery, the iron oven still standing like a monument to ordinary life, until he reached a half-collapsed house, where the melody grew louder. That's where he saw her. A child, perhaps 6 years old, sat in what had been a parlor, surrounded by walls open to the sky. She wore a coat far too large, her blonde hair matted with dust, her small hands cradling a wooden music box painted with tiny blue flowers. The mechanism turned, and the delicate tune filled the ruins with an eerie beauty. Marcel's breath caught. His wife Marie had owned a similar box, destroyed when their Paris apartment was bombed in 1943. The sight of it now, in this dead place, felt like a message from a world that no longer existed. "Bonjour, petite," he said softly, approaching with the caution one uses with wounded animals. The girl looked up. Her eyes were enormous and gray, holding depths no child's eyes should contain. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't move except to clutch the music box tighter. Marcel knelt in the rubble, glass crunching beneath his boots. He'd been a school teacher before the war, before he'd joined the resistance, before he'd learned to kill. He knew how to speak to frightened children. "Are you alone here?" She nodded once. "What's your name?" "Greta." The word came out barely above a whisper, but perfectly pronounced. Perfect French, without accent or hesitation. "Where is your family, Greta?" She pointed to a collapsed wall where Marcel could see the edge of what had been a cellar. He didn't need to investigate further. The Wehrmacht had swept through this region in their retreat, and the SS had followed, scorching the earth behind them. Whatever had happened in that cellar, this child was the sole survivor. "I'm Marcel," he said gently. "I'm with the French army. You're safe now." She studied his face with an intensity that unnerved him. Then, slowly, she held out the music box. "It's beautiful," Marcel said, taking it carefully. He examined the craftsmanship. German, clearly. Expensive. The kind of thing that spoke of wealth and old families. On the bottom, barely visible, were initials carved into the wood. "GV. May I keep it?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Of course. It's yours." Marcel tried to coax more information from her. Her full name, her parents' names, where she'd come from. But she seemed to have retreated into herself, answering only in nods and shakes of her head. Shell shock, Marcel thought. He'd seen it in soldiers, the mind protecting itself from unbearable truth. As he carried her to the jeep, her arms wrapped tight around his neck, Marcel felt something shift in his chest. Since Marie's death, he'd moved through the world like a ghost, performing his duties but feeling nothing. Now, with this trembling child pressed against him, he felt the first stirring of purpose. The drive back to his temporary post in Strasbourg took 3 hours. Greta fell asleep against his shoulder, and Marcel found himself making a decision that defied all protocol. He should take her to the refugee center, where displaced children were processed, documented, reunited with surviving family when possible. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way she'd looked at him with those ancient eyes. Perhaps it was the music box, that echo of Marie. Perhaps it was simply that he couldn't bear to deposit this small, broken thing into the machinery of military bureaucracy. When they reached Strasbourg, Marcel drove past the refugee center and headed instead to his commandeered apartment. His sister Claire was staying with him temporarily, helping sort supplies for displaced persons. She met them at the door, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as Marcel climbed the stairs with the sleeping child. "Marcel, what have you done?" Claire whispered as he laid Greta on the sofa. She was alone, Claire, the only survivor in a village outside Haguenau. Then she needs to go to the proper authorities. She needs to be safe. Marcel's voice was firm. She needs someone who will see her as a child, not a case file. Claire studied her brother's face, seeing something there she hadn't seen in the 2 years since Marie's death. Life, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. "You're thinking of keeping her." It wasn't a question. Marcel looked at Greta, curled on his sofa, clutching her music box, even in sleep. "I'm thinking of giving her a chance." That night, as Claire prepared a bed and found clean clothes, Marcel sat at his desk filling out preliminary paperwork. Greta's full name, he wrote, was unknown. Parents, deceased. Origin, Alsace. He didn't mention the German music box or the expensive coat or the cultivated way she spoke French. He didn't mention, because he'd only just discovered it, that when she'd fallen asleep in the Jeep, she'd begun murmuring, not in French, in German. A perfect native German that suggested she wasn't from Alsace at all, but from somewhere much deeper in enemy territory, and that the story she couldn't or wouldn't tell might be far more complicated than a simple war orphan's tale. But Marcel had already decided. Whatever Greta's past, she deserved a future. What he couldn't know, as he signed his name to those papers, was that her past was already reaching out for her, already preparing to pull them both into a web of secrets that stretched from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from concentration camps to monastery hideaways, where the defeated Reich was becoming something else entirely, something patient, something watching. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if you're invested in finding out what happens to Marcel and Greta, hit that like button and subscribe. This story only gets darker from here. Greta didn't speak for 3 weeks. Marcel had been warned by the military physician who examined her, a cursory visit arranged discreetly through Claire's connections, that selective mutism was common in traumatized children, that patience was the only medicine. But knowing this didn't make the silence easier to bear. The Beaumont apartment occupied the second floor of a narrow building on Rue des Juifs, in Strasbourg's old quarter, where medieval timber frames leaned against each other like exhausted soldiers. The rooms smelled of coal smoke and the neighbor's cabbage soup, and winter light filtered through leaded glass windows that had somehow survived the war intact. Marcel's posting here was temporary, sorting through captured German documents, identifying war criminals, preparing evidence for the tribunals that would begin in the new year. It was grim work, but it kept him busy while Greta slowly emerged from her shell. She was an unnervingly tidy child. Each morning she made her bed with military precision, corners tucked just so. She ate whatever Claire prepared without complaint, always finishing her plate, always saying merci in that whisper-soft voice when she finally began speaking again. She never asked for anything, never cried, never played. Except with the music box. Every evening, as Marcel worked at his desk translating German files, Greta would sit cross-legged on the floor and wind the mechanism, letting the melody fill the small apartment. Sometimes she'd hum along, wordless, haunting harmonies that suggested she knew the tune well. "It's from Die Zauberflöte," Claire said one evening in mid-December, as they washed dishes while Greta prepared for bed. "Mozart's magic flute, the melody of the Queen of the Night." Marcel paused, his hands in the soapy water. "You're certain?" "I saw it performed in Paris before the war. That exact aria." Claire dried a plate slowly. "Marcel, that's not a French lullaby. That's German high culture, opera." The implication hung between them. French children, even in Alsace, didn't typically own expensive German music boxes playing Mozart operas. German children did. Wealthy German children from educated families. "I don't care," Marcel said quietly. "She's here now. She's safe, that's what matters." But he did care. The question gnawed at him during his long days sorting through Nazi documents, many of them detailing the evacuation of German civilians as the Reich collapsed. Had Greta's family fled east? Had they been party members, collaborators, true believers, or simply people caught in the machinery of war? By January of 1946, as Strasbourg shivered under snow and the Nuremberg trials filled the newspapers, Greta had begun speaking in full sentences. She called Marcel Papa Marcel without prompting, which made his throat tight every time. She helped Claire with cooking, her small hands surprisingly skilled at kneading dough and peeling potatoes. She even smiled, occasionally, quick, fragile expressions that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Marcel had officially petitioned to adopt her, claiming he was a widower with no children seeking to provide a home for a war orphan. The paperwork moved slowly through the bureaucracy, but no one seemed particularly concerned. There were thousands of displaced children. One more finding a home was a small victory in an ocean of tragedy. What changed everything was the morning Marcel found Greta standing at the window, staring down at the street with an expression of pure terror. "What is it, ma petite?" he asked, crossing to her. She pointed with a trembling finger at a man on the corner. Middle-aged, unremarkable in his gray coat and hat, smoking a cigarette while pretending to read a newspaper. "Do you know him?" She shook her head violently, but Marcel saw the lie. Her entire body had gone rigid, and she was clutching the windowsill so hard her knuckles were white. Marcel watched the man for 5 minutes. He never turned a page of the newspaper. He never looked up at their window. But his position gave him a perfect view of their building's entrance. "Stay here," Marcel instructed, but Greta grabbed his arm. "Non," she whispered. "S'il vous plaît, Papa Marcel. Don't go." The fear in her voice stopped him. He'd seen her withdrawn, seen her sad, but never terrified. Not like this. By the time he looked back at the street, the man was gone. That night, Marcel lay awake listening to the building settle, to the distant sound of trains and church bells. In the next room, Greta cried out in her sleep. "Nein! Bitte, nein!" German words tumbling from her in distress. Marcel went to her, held her as she trembled, whispered soothing nonsense until she calmed. When he finally slept, he dreamed of Marie. She stood in their old apartment, whole and alive, and said only, "Be careful what you save. Sometimes the rescued carry their rescuers into darkness." He woke at dawn to find Greta sitting at the kitchen table, the music box open before her. But she wasn't winding it. She was staring at something inside. A small piece of paper she'd apparently discovered hidden in the mechanism's base. Marcel approached slowly. What is that, Cherie? She looked up at him with those enormous gray eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked like what she was, a frightened child carrying an impossible burden. It's a name, she whispered, and an address, in Switzerland. Marcel took the paper carefully. The handwriting was elegant, clearly feminine. Christina Vogel Postfach, 247 Zurich. Below that, a single line in German. When it's safe, come home. Marcel felt his world tilting. This wasn't a random orphan he'd saved from the rubble. This was a German child with family. German family with resources enough to maintain a Swiss postal box, with connections enough to hide messages in music boxes, with reasons to stay hidden. Who is Christina Vogel? He asked gently. Greta's answer came in a whisper that changed everything. My mother. But she wasn't in the cellar. She wasn't among the dead. She was alive somewhere, waiting. And someone on the street below had recognized her daughter. The war, Marcel realized with growing dread, wasn't over after all. Not for Greta. And now, not for him either. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in late February. Marcel found it on the doorstep when he returned from work, his boots crunching through gray slush as twilight settled over Strasbourg. Plain brown paper, no return address, his name written in precise block letters across the front. But it was the stamp that made his blood freeze. Swiss, postmarked Zurich, dated 3 days earlier. Someone knew where Greta was. Someone knew Marcel had her. Inside the apartment, Claire was teaching Greta to knit, their heads bent together over clicking needles and cream-colored wool. The domestic scene, lamplight, the smell of rabbit stew simmering, a child's concentrated frown, felt suddenly fragile, like glass about to shatter. I need to speak with you, Marcel said quietly to Claire, tilting his head toward the hallway. In the cramped space outside the apartment, with the neighbor's radio playing swing music through thin walls, Marcel handed her the envelope. Claire's face went pale as she read the single sheet inside. The letter was in French, but the formality of the phrasing carried a Germanic precision. Monsieur Beaumont, we know you have taken custody of the child. This is acceptable for now. She is safer with you than in institutional care, where questions would be asked that benefit no one. However, you must understand that Greta is not what she appears. Her family has obligations that transcend the war's conclusion. When the time comes, and it will come soon, she must be returned to us. Do not attempt to trace this letter. Do not involve authorities. Such actions would force us to consider you an obstacle rather than a temporary guardian. The girl's brother will make contact in due course. You will recognize him when he arrives. We are watching. We are patient. Heil. The final word had been crossed out, replaced with respectfully. Claire's hand trembled as she lowered the paper. Marcel, these are Nazis, active Nazis. They're threatening you. They're telling me I'm keeping her safe for them. Marcel's voice was hollow. That I'm just a caretaker until they're ready to collect her. You have to go to your commanding officer, to the authorities investigating war criminals, and tell them what? That I've been hiding a German child without proper documentation? That I've been lying on official reports? Marcel ran a hand through his hair. I'd lose her immediately. She'd disappear into the system, and these people, whoever they are, would simply wait and take her from whatever facility she ended up in. Then what do you do? Marcel looked through the window at Greta, still focused on her knitting, her small face serious with concentration. In 3 months, she'd become the center of his rebuilt life. The reason he came home each evening. The reason he bothered to imagine a future beyond simply existing. "I find out who she really is," he said, "before they come for her." The next morning, Marcel used his military credentials to access the central registry of German civilian evacuations. He searched for families named Vogel from cities in eastern Germany, Berlin, Dresden, Munich. There were hundreds. But when he cross-referenced with Zurich banking connections and high-ranking party affiliations, the list narrowed dramatically. One name emerged like a ghost from the files: Oberfuhrer Heinrich Vogel, SS officer, assigned to the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin. Specialty, financial operations and asset protection. Last confirmed location: April 1945, Berlin, during the final collapse. Status: missing, presumed dead. But Marcel had learned in his months of document analysis that missing, presumed dead was the Reich's favorite magic trick. It meant escape routes through Italy, through Spain, through Norway. It meant new identities in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil. It meant networks that had spent years preparing for this exact contingency. He found a photograph attached to Heinrich Vogel's file. A stern man in SS black, perhaps 40 years old, with Greta's same gray eyes and sharp cheekbones. Standing beside him in the photo was a woman, Christina Vogel, née Schmidt, blonde and elegant. And between them, 2 children. A girl, perhaps 3 years old in the photograph, dated 1942, and a boy, maybe 12, already wearing the uniform of the Hitler Youth. Marcel studied the boy's face. Even in the grainy photograph, there was something unsettling about his expression. Too controlled, too watchful for a child. The caption listed his name: Werner Vogel. Greta had a brother, and if Heinrich Vogel had been important enough to warrant his own intelligence file, then his children weren't just displaced orphans. They were valuable assets, heirs to knowledge, connections, perhaps even hidden wealth. That evening, Marcel found Greta on the apartment's narrow balcony, watching snow fall over the cathedral spires. The music box sat beside her, closed now, silent. "Ma petite," he said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be brave and tell me the truth." She looked up at him, and he saw that she already knew, had perhaps been waiting for this moment since the day he'd found her. "Your real name," Marcel said. "It's Greta Vogel, isn't it?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And your father? He was SS?" Another nod. "Where is he now, Greta? Do you know?" Her voice came out broken, barely audible. "Papa said, if Berlin fell, we should go to the mountain house in Bavaria. He said people would come for us. Special people who would keep us safe until the Reich could rise again." Marcel felt something crack open in his chest. This child, his child now, in every way that mattered, had been raised in the heart of the monster, had absorbed its poison without understanding what it was. "And your brother, Werner, where is he?" "I don't know." The tears came harder now. "We were separated when the Russians came. Mama said Werner was strong, that he would survive and find us. She made me promise." Her voice broke. "She made me promise to wait for him." Marcel knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed. Over her shoulder, through the falling snow, he could see the street below. And there, standing beneath the street lamp in the same gray coat, was the man from before. Watching. Waiting. Marcel held Greta tighter, and for the first time since finding her in those ruins, he wondered if love was enough, if his small act of rescue had been anything more than a temporary reprieve. because Werner Vogel was coming. And when he arrived, Marcel would have to choose between the child he'd saved and the monster she'd been raised to serve. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like the snow collecting on the balcony railing, silent, cold, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Marcel stopped sleeping. Instead, he sat at his desk through the small hours while Strasbourg dreamed, translating captured documents with new urgency, searching for patterns in the chaos of the Reich's final days. The apartment's radiator clanked and hissed, and outside, the Rhine flowed dark and eternal toward the sea. He was looking for something specific now: escape routes, safe houses, the infrastructure of survival that men like Heinrich Vogel would have built years before the end. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. The document spoke of Die Spinne, the spider, a network designed specifically to evacuate high-value SS officers and their families. Routes through the Alps into Italy, sympathetic priests providing papers, rat lines stretching across oceans. But more disturbing were the internal memoranda discussing assets of the future, children of the Reich elite, to be preserved, educated, prepared for a resurgence that might take decades. Werner Vogel's name appeared in 3 separate files. Once, in a Hitler Youth leadership roster from 1943, noted as exceptional ideological commitment. Once, in an evacuation priority list from April 1945, marked retrieve at all costs. And once, in a fragmentary intelligence report from the American OSS, dated December 1945. Subject believed to be in northern Italy, possibly Venice region. Accompanied by handler identified as Father Bernard. Evaded capture in Turin. That last report was only 2 months old. Werner wasn't just coming. He was already in Europe, already moving, already closing the distance. Marcel's hands shook as he copied the information into his personal notebook. At dawn, he burned the original documents in the kitchen sink, an act that could cost him his commission if discovered. But he couldn't risk anyone else seeing these files. Couldn't risk questions about why he was so interested in one particular SS family. "You look terrible," Claire said when she arrived that morning with fresh bread. She'd been staying with a friend recently, giving Marcel and Greta space, but she visited daily. "Have you slept at all?" "How can I?" Marcel gestured at his notes. "There's a network, Claire. Organized, funded, international. And they're coming for her. Then you run. Take Greta and disappear." "Where?" "They have resources I can't imagine. And I'm just a school teacher playing soldier." He laughed bitterly. "I thought I was saving her. But maybe I've just been keeping her warm until they're ready to collect their investment." Claire gripped his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. That child loves you. She calls you Papa. Whatever she was born into, whatever poison her family planted in her mind, you're giving her something different, something real. That matters." But Marcel wasn't sure anymore. Lately, he'd caught Greta staring at photographs of her old family, kept hidden beneath her mattress. He'd seen her, lips moving silently, and when he'd leaned closer, he'd realized she was reciting something memorized. Deutschland über alles in der Welt. The old anthem, the forbidden words. She'd stopped immediately when she noticed him, shame flooding her small face. But the damage was done. The programming ran deep. That afternoon, Marcel took Greta to the park along the Ill River, where skeletal trees reached toward a white sky and ducks paddled through near-frozen water. She wore the red coat Claire had bought her blonde hair in braids, looking like any other French child enjoying the brief February sunshine. "Tell me about Werner," Marcel said as they walked. What was he like? Greta was quiet for a long moment, her breath making small clouds. He was perfect. That's what everyone said. He won medals for marksmanship. He led his unit in the Landdienst work camps. He could recite the Führer's speeches from memory. She kicked at a frozen puddle. He scared me sometimes. The way he looked at people who weren't like us. Not like you, how? Not German enough. Not pure enough. She looked up at Marcel with those ancient eyes. Werner said the war would cleanse the world, that Germany would rise from the ashes stronger, that our family had a sacred duty to survive and remember. Sacred duty. The words hung in the cold air like poison. And now? Marcel asked gently. What do you believe now? Greta stopped walking. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Werner in his Hitler Youth uniform, perhaps 13 years old, standing at rigid attention. His eyes, even in the faded image, held absolute conviction. I don't know what I believe anymore, she whispered, but Papa Marcel. I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid of what he'll do when he finds us. I won't let him hurt you. It's not me I'm afraid for. She looked at Marcel with heartbreaking clarity. He'll see you as a traitor, someone who's contaminating me with democratic weakness. He'll kill you, Papa Marcel, and he'll make me watch, to teach me about loyalty. The matter-of-fact way she said it, as if execution for ideological deviation was simply how the world worked, made Marcel's stomach turn. This was what they'd done to children. Warped love into obedience, family into fascism. That evening, as Greta slept, Marcel wrote a letter to his brother's family in Marseille. If something happened to him, he needed someone to protect Greta. Someone outside the military structure, outside the obvious places these people would look. He was sealing the envelope when he heard the knock. 3 precise raps. A pause. Then 2 more. The pattern from the Reich's internal security protocols. A code he'd learned from captured documents. A code that meant, I am one of yours. Let me in. Marcel moved to the window and looked down at the street. Empty. Whoever had knocked was directly outside his door in the building's hallway. He checked that. Greta was still sleeping, then picked up the pistol he'd started keeping in his desk drawer. His hands were steady as he approached the door, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Who's there? He called softly in German. The response came in the same language, a voice that was young but carried an adult's certainty. I've come for my sister. Werner. Marcel pressed his forehead against the door, feeling the weight of everything converging, love and duty, past and future, the child sleeping in the next room and the monster waiting in the hall. He thought of Marie, of the life they'd planned before the war swallowed everything. He thought of Greta's small hand in his, the way she'd started humming French songs instead of German ones, the tiny acts of rebellion against her programming. He thought of what Claire had said. You're giving her something different. Marcel made his choice. He opened the door. The boy standing in the hallway was tall for 15, lean and hard in a way that spoke of deprivation and discipline. He wore civilian clothes, but he stood with military bearing. His gray eyes, Greta's eyes, Heinrich Vogel's eyes, swept over Marcel with cold assessment. You're the one who's been keeping her, Werner said. Not a question. I'm the one who saved her life, Marcel replied in German. Werner's smile was terrible, the smile of someone who'd learned cruelty as a virtue. That's what you tell yourself, but you're just the temporary shelter. I've come to take her home. Behind Marcel, A small voice shattered the moment. "Werner?" Greta stood in the doorway to her room, her face caught between hope and terror, between the brother she'd been taught to worship and the safety she'd found with Marcel. And in that frozen instant, Marcel understood the real battle had only just begun. Marcel didn't sleep after Werner left. He sat at the kitchen table with his service pistol disassembled before him, cleaning each piece with methodical precision while his mind raced through scenarios, each one ending worse than the last. Outside, Strasbourg slept under a thin blanket of snow, oblivious to the war still being fought in its shadows. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 3 in the morning, each second bringing them closer to whatever Werner's handlers were planning. Greta had finally cried herself to sleep around midnight, curled on the sofa with the music box clutched to her chest. Marcel watched the shallow rise and fall of her breathing and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like stones. He could turn her over to the authorities, tell them everything, and hope the truth would be enough. But Werner's network had already demonstrated their reach. The letter from Zurich, the watcher on the street, the boy himself appearing in Marcel's hallway. They had resources, connections, patience. The bureaucracy would be slow, and these people were fast. Or he could run. The thought crystallized as dawn touched the windows with pale gray light. Not just leaving Strasbourg, but disappearing completely. Taking Greta somewhere these people couldn't follow, couldn't predict, couldn't reach. He was reassembling the pistol when Claire let herself in with her spare key, carrying fresh bread and the morning's newspaper. Her face told him everything before she even opened her mouth. "You need to see this," she said, unfolding the paper on the table. But it wasn't the headline that made Marcel's blood freeze, though that was bad enough. His military photo staring out beside a story about a disturbed former soldier who'd taken unauthorized custody of a German child. It was the smaller article on page 3, the one Claire pointed to with a shaking finger. Body found in Strasbourg Canal, military investigator apparent suicide. Captain Robert Chevrier, 42, an investigator with the French military police, was found dead yesterday evening in the canal near Petite France. Authorities report he'd been despondent over personal matters. Chevrier had recently been assigned to review irregular adoption cases from the immediate post-war period. Marcel read it twice, his mind connecting dots he wished would stay separate. Chevrier had been the officer reviewing Marcel's adoption petition for Greta, a man who asked thorough questions, who'd noticed inconsistencies in Marcel's documentation, who'd scheduled a formal interview for next week. "They killed him," Marcel said quietly. "To close that avenue of investigation, to make sure no one looked too closely at Greta's case. You don't know that. It could have been. Claire, how many suicides have you heard of where the victim jumps into a canal in February? In the middle of the night?" Marcel stood up, his decision made. They're eliminating obstacles. Anyone who might ask the wrong questions or look too carefully at Greta's origins. Chevrier was just the first. Then you go to someone higher up, someone they can't touch. There is no one they can't touch. That's the point. Marcel moved to the window, watching the street below. Empty now, but for how long? They spent years building rat lines out of Berlin. Do you think they didn't place people in the new French government? The police? The military? Claire sank into a chair, the bread forgotten. "So what do you do?" "I get Greta somewhere safe, somewhere outside France, outside their network's obvious reach." He turned to face his sister. "And then I come back and I burn them down." "Marcel, They murdered Chevrier because he was doing his job. They've turned Werner into a weapon. They're planning to do the same to Greta, raise her as some kind of princess of the new Reich, a living symbol for their resurrection. His voice hardened. I won't let that happen. Greta stirred on the sofa, waking slowly. She sat up, her hair tangled, her face creased from the cushion, looking achingly young and vulnerable. Papa Marcel? Her voice was small. I had a bad dream. Werner was... She stopped, seeing his expression, seeing the newspaper. What's happened? Marcel knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. We need to leave Strasbourg, ma petite. Today. Right now. Can you be very brave and very strong? She nodded, tears already forming. Because of what Werner said? Because they're coming back? Because I made a promise to keep you safe. And I always keep my promises. Within an hour, they were moving. Claire had obtained a delivery truck through a contact, who owed her favors from the resistance days, a man who asked no questions and would report no answers. Marcel packed only essentials: clothes, documents, the money he'd been saving, his pistol and ammunition. Greta insisted on bringing her drawings from the refrigerator, each one carefully rolled and secured with string, and the music box. Always the music box. They left through the building's rear entrance at dawn, when the streets were empty except for early delivery men and street sweepers. Marcel had already sent a telegram to his brother in Marseille, using a false name, a coded message from their resistance days. The blackbirds are flying south. Prepare the nest. It meant, I'm in trouble. Don't contact me. Be ready to help however you can. Claire drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Marcel sat beside her studying a map of southern France. Greta was wedged between them, the music box on her lap, watching the city fall away behind them. Where are we going? She asked as they crossed the Rhine. South, Marcel said. Then west. Then... He hesitated, then decided she deserved truth. Spain, eventually. I have friends there, people who understand what it means to run from fascism. Will Werner follow us? Yes. Will you kill him if he does? The question hung in the cab like smoke. Claire's hands tightened on the wheel. Marcel looked at this child who'd been raised in the heart of the Reich's darkness, who'd been taught that violence was honor and death was glory, and chose his words carefully. I'll do whatever I must to protect you, but I won't become what they are. That's the difference between us and them, Greta. We remember that life is sacred. She was quiet for a long moment then. Werner told me once that mercy was weakness, that our Father proved his strength by eliminating weak elements. She looked up at Marcel with those two old eyes. Is that true? Your father was wrong. Mercy is the hardest kind of strength. Anyone can kill. It takes real courage to choose not to. They drove south through the Vosges, through villages still bearing the scars of war, burned buildings, makeshift memorials, women in black. At a fuel stop outside Epinal, Marcel saw the owner studying his face too long, glancing at a newspaper folded beside the register. We need to move faster, he told Claire. The story's already spreading. But as they climbed back into the truck, a police car pulled into the station. Two gendarmes emerged, and one of them looked directly at Marcel. Recognition flickered across his face, that moment of connection between photograph and reality. He reached for his radio. Go, Marcel said quietly to Claire. Drive. Now. She gunned the engine, pulling out of the station as the gendarme shouted after them. In the side mirror, Marcel watched the police car's lights begin to flash, watched it pull onto the road behind them. Papa Marcel? Greta's voice was tight with fear. It's all right, he lied. Everything's all right. But as they raced south with the police following, as Claire took turns too fast and Greta pressed against his side, Marcel understood that everything had just become infinitely more complicated. They weren't just running from Werner's network anymore. They were fugitives from the law itself. And somewhere behind them, Werner was receiving word that his sister and her kidnapper had been spotted, had been marked, had begun the chase that could only end one way. The hunt had begun in earnest. The delivery truck's engine screamed as Claire pushed it beyond its limits, the vehicle shuddering with each gear change as they climbed into the Massif Central. Behind them, the police car matched their speed, its siren cutting through the morning air like a saw blade, and Marcel knew they couldn't outrun law enforcement on these mountain roads. Not in a truck meant for steady deliveries. Not with a child between them who'd already lost too much. The landscape changed as they climbed higher, bare winter forests giving way to snow-dusted plateaus where the wind howled across volcanic stone. The villages they passed through were small and suspicious, places where strangers were noted and remembered, where a fleeing truck with police in pursuit would become the story told in every café for months. "There's a turn-off ahead," Marcel said, studying the map. "An old logging road. We take it and hope they miss us in the trees." But the gendarmes didn't miss it. They followed the truck onto the narrow track, and now they were committed, racing through dense pine forest, where branches scraped both sides of the vehicle, where ice made the road treacherous, where one wrong turn would mean a fatal plunge down the mountainside. Greta pressed against Marcel, her breathing shallow, the music box clutched so tight her knuckles were white. She hadn't spoken since the chase began, but her eyes held a terrible knowledge, the understanding that this was her fault, that Marcel was risking everything because of her. "Papa Marcel," she whispered, "you should stop. Let them take me. You can say I forced you, that you were—" "Never." His voice was absolute. "Whatever happens, we stay together." The logging road dead-ended at an abandoned mill, its roof collapsed, its water wheel frozen mid-turn over an icy stream. Claire slammed on the brakes, and the truck fishtailed to a stop in the clearing. Behind them, the police car pulled up, blocking their only exit. The gendarmes emerged with weapons drawn, the same young officer from before, now accompanied by an older sergeant with the weathered face of a man who'd seen too many wars. "Step out of the vehicle," the sergeant called. "Hands visible." Marcel climbed down slowly, positioning himself between the officers and the truck where Greta remained hidden. The wind cut through his coat, carrying the smell of pine resin and snow, and overhead, crows circled like they knew what was coming. "Lieutenant Beaumont," the sergeant said, lowering his weapon slightly. "I know who you are. I know what you did during the war. The bridge at Colmar. I was there. You saved a lot of lives that day. Then you know I'm not a criminal. I know what the papers say. And I know orders are orders." The sergeant's expression was conflicted. "The child needs to come with us. There are procedures, proper channels. The proper channels are compromised." Marcel's voice was steady despite his racing heart. "The people claiming to be her family are Nazis, former SS. They're using the system to reclaim a child they see as property." The younger gendarme scoffed. "That's what all kidnappers say." "Shut up, Renard," the sergeant snapped. He studied Marcel with sharp eyes. "You have proof of this?" "I have documents, evidence. But I also have a dead military investigator floating in the Strasbourg Canal because he asked too many questions about this case. Marcel held the sergeant's gaze. How long before we're both in that canal, mon ami? How long before anyone who knows the truth becomes an obstacle? The sergeant's jaw tightened. He'd survived the war by learning to read situations quickly, by understanding when orders came from legitimate authority and when they served darker purposes. Show me the documents. Marcel retrieved his folder from the truck, the files he'd illegally copied, the photographs of Heinrich Vogel in SS uniform, the intelligence reports about Werner's movements through Italy. He spread them on the truck's hood while the wind tried to scatter them, while Claire whispered urgently to Greta to stay hidden, while the crows overhead cawed like witnesses at a trial. The sergeant read in silence, his expression darkening with each page. When he reached the photograph of Werner in Hitler Youth uniform, he swore softly. This is the brother? The one claiming to be her family? 15 years old and trained to kill, accompanied by handlers who murdered a French officer to protect their operation. The younger gendarme, Renard, had moved closer to read over his superior's shoulder. His face had gone pale. Sergeant, if this is true, we've been used to hunt a hero protecting a child from the people who should be in prison. The sergeant looked at Marcel. Where were you planning to take her? Spain. I have contacts in Barcelona. People who understand. You'll never make it. Not in that truck. Not with your face in every newspaper. The sergeant was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he made a decision that Marcel would remember for the rest of his life. Renard, give me your handcuffs. The young officer obeyed, confused. The sergeant walked to Marcel and snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, but loosely, with the key pressed into Marcel's palm. What are you doing? Renard asked. We pursued the suspect into the mountains, the sergeant said, his voice taking on the flat tone of official reporting. He abandoned his vehicle and fled on foot with the child. We conducted a search, but couldn't locate them in the terrain. We're calling for reinforcements. He looked at Marcel. That gives you maybe 6 hours before they send dogs and more officers. Use them. Sergeant, Renard started to protest. That's an order, soldat. We report what I said we report. The sergeant's voice allowed no argument. He turned back to Marcel. There's a shepherd's hut 3 kilometers northwest of here. Stone building, blue door. The shepherd, old Mathieu, he was resistance too. He'll help you. Marcel felt his throat tighten. Why are you doing this? Because I spent 4 years fighting fascists. I'm not about to hand a child back to them now. The sergeant collected the documents, folding them carefully. I'll make sure these reach someone who can actually do something with them. Someone outside the compromised channels. But you need to disappear, Beaumont. And I mean truly disappear. Because the people hunting you won't give up. And next time you might not find a sergeant who remembers Colmar. Through the truck window, Greta had been watching everything. Now she climbed down, her small figure dwarfed by Marcel's coat, the music box under her arm. Thank you, she said to the sergeant, her voice clear and precise. Merci, monsieur. The sergeant knelt to her level, his gruff face softening. De rien, petite. You take care of that one, understand? He's one of the good ones. I know, Greta said. That's why I chose him. As Marcel and Claire gathered what they could carry and prepared to vanish into the forest, as the sergeant radioed in his false report and young Renard watched with wide eyes as snow began to fall again, like nature's own curtain drawing closed on this scene. Werner Vogel was already moving north toward them. He'd received word of the chase, the roadblock, the location where his sister had been cornered. And he was bringing more than just his handlers this time. He was bringing the full weight of the network that had spent months watching, waiting, planning. Because the spider's web stretched far, and its patience was finally at an end. The final confrontation was coming, in the mountains where snow covered all sins and the wind carried away all screams, where two visions of Europe's future would collide over the fate of one small girl. And only one vision would survive to see spring. The shepherd's hut appeared through swirling snow, like a ghost materializing from memory. Stone walls blackened by centuries of smoke, a blue door weathered to the color of bruises, a single window glowing with firelight that meant old Mathieu was home. Marcel's legs burned from the 3-kilometer climb, and Greta had stopped speaking an hour ago, conserving her energy for the brutal ascent through deep snow. Claire had stayed behind with the truck, agreeing to lead any pursuit away from the route Marcel and Greta were taking. The separation had been agonizing. Claire pressing her forehead to Marcel's, whispering, "Save her. That's all that matters now." Marcel knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. The resistance code for friendly approach. The door opened to reveal a man who looked carved from the same stone as his hut. Gray beard, weathered face, eyes that had seen everything and forgiven nothing. He studied Marcel and Greta for exactly 3 seconds, then stepped aside. Inside, quickly. The interior was a single room, dominated by a hearth where a pot of something that smelled like heaven simmered over the fire. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a narrow bed occupied one corner. The walls were bare except for a single photograph. Young men in resistance armbands, standing in these same mountains, their faces fierce with purpose. Marcel recognized one of them as a much younger Mathieu, recognized another as his own brother, dead these 3 years from a German bullet. "You knew Thomas," Marcel said quietly. "I knew many who didn't come home." Mathieu ladled soup into wooden bowls. "Eat, then tell me why you're running." They ate in silence, thick vegetable soup that tasted of time and desperation. Greta finished every drop, her small hands wrapped around the bowl for warmth. When she was done, she curled into the chair nearest the fire, her eyes already closing. Marcel told Mathieu everything. The girl in the ruins, the music box, Werner's arrival, the dead investigator, the network that wanted Greta back not as a daughter, but as a symbol. He laid out the documents the sergeant had let him keep copies of, evidence of a conspiracy that stretched from Berlin to Buenos Aires. Mathieu listened without interruption, his face growing harder with each revelation. When Marcel finished, the old man was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "I spent 4 years in these mountains," Mathieu finally said, "fighting the Reich. Lost my son, my brother, most of my friends. We thought when Berlin fell, when Hitler put a bullet in his head, that it was over." He looked at Greta's sleeping form. "But evil doesn't die. It just changes clothes and waits. Will you help us?" "I'll do better than that." Mathieu stood, moving to a loose stone in the wall. Behind it was a metal box containing papers, money, and 2 pistols. "There's a monastery 3 valleys over. Cistercian monks. They've been sheltering people since the war ended. Refugees, displaced persons, people the world forgot. The abbot, Father Sebastian, he'll hide you both until this storm passes. And if it doesn't pass, then you pray God gives you the strength to do what must be done." They rested until dusk, when the mountain paths would be less visible to any searchers. Mathieu gave them warmer clothes, walking sticks, and a map to the monastery. He also pressed his own pistol into Marcel's hand. "Just in case prayer isn't enough," the old shepherd said. As they prepared to leave, Greta suddenly spoke, her voice small but clear. "The music box has more than names in it." Both men turned to her. She'd been so quiet Marcel had thought she was still sleeping. "What do you mean, petite?" he asked. "Papa, my father, before he left for the last time, he showed me." Her fingers traced the wooden case. "There's a false bottom? Inside are diamonds, lots of them? He said they were for rebuilding, that we'd need money that couldn't be traced or seized." Marcel felt his world shift again. No wonder Werner wanted the box so desperately. It wasn't just contact information. It was funding for the entire network's future operations. "How much?" He said enough to buy a small country. Greta's eyes filled with tears. "I was going to tell you, Papa Marcel. I was just scared that if you knew how valuable it was, you might want to use me like they do." Marcel knelt before her, taking her small face in his hands. "Listen to me. You could be carrying all the gold in France, and it wouldn't change how I feel about you. You're not valuable because of what you have. You're valuable because of who you are." She threw her arms around his neck and sobbed, great shuddering cries of relief and exhaustion and hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in this broken world loved her for herself. They left the hut as stars emerged through breaking clouds, following Mathieu's directions down one valley and up another. The monastery was supposed to be 4 hours away, but they were moving slowly, Greta's small legs struggling with the terrain despite her determination. They were halfway there when Marcel heard it. Voices, multiple men, calling to each other in German, flashlights cutting through the darkness below them, methodically searching. Werner had found their trail. Marcel pulled Greta behind a boulder, pressing a finger to his lips. Through the darkness, he counted at least 6 lights, moving in a coordinated search pattern. Professional, military. "Stay here," he whispered. "No matter what happens, you stay hidden." "Papa Marcel, no? Promise me." Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. Marcel moved away from the boulder, making himself visible on the path above. He whistled, sharp and clear, drawing the searchers' attention. The lights converged on his position. Werner's voice called out, "I know that's you, Monsieur Beaumont. Where is my sister?" "Long gone," Marcel shouted back. "Safe where you'll never find her." "Then you've outlived your usefulness." Gunfire cracked through the mountain air. Marcel dove behind cover as bullets sparked off stone. He returned fire with Mathieu's pistol, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back, to buy time. But there were too many of them, too well armed, too well trained. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell, the pistol clattering away, blood hot against his cold skin. Werner appeared above him, flanked by his handlers, their faces hard and emotionless. The boy, who was not quite a boy anymore, held a Luger with the casual competence of someone who'd killed before. "Where is she?" Werner demanded. Marcel smiled through the pain. "You'll never know." Werner raised the pistol, aiming at Marcel's head. "Then you're no longer useful." But before he could fire, a child's voice cut through the darkness. "Werner, stop!" Greta stepped into view, holding the music box, standing at the edge of a cliff where the path dropped away into darkness. "One more step," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling, "and I throw it over. All of Papa's diamonds, all his precious contacts. Everything you need, gone." Werner froze. The handlers exchanged panicked glances. "Greta, don't be foolish." "I'm not foolish. I'm choosing." She looked at Marcel, bleeding on the ground, and then at her brother. You taught me that strength means sacrifice, that Germany's greatness required hard choices. So here's my choice. Let Papa Marcel live, let us both walk away, and you get the music box. Or I destroy everything, and you go home with nothing. You wouldn't try me. The wind howled across the cliff face, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then Werner slowly lowered his weapon. Let the Frenchman live, he said to his handlers. Take the box and the girl. We can convince her later of her true purpose. No, Greta said. You don't understand. I'm not going with you. She held the music box over the abyss. This is my price. You leave us both alone forever, or the Reich's future goes into the valley below. A 7-year-old girl, standing at the edge of darkness, holding the weight of a dying empire in her small hands, and demanding her freedom as the cost of its continuation. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours suspended in ice. Werner's finger hovered over the trigger, his handlers shifting positions to get clearer shots, and Greta stood at the cliff's edge with the music box extended over darkness. One small girl holding a dying empire hostage with nothing but her willingness to let it fall. You're bluffing, Werner said, but his voice wavered. You wouldn't destroy Papa's legacy. Everything he worked for, everything we're meant to rebuild. Papa's legacy is ash and death, Greta said, her voice eerily calm. I saw what his great Reich did. The villages burned, the people starved, the children left alone to die in the rubble. She looked at Marcel, bleeding on the frozen ground. This man taught me something Papa never did. That love doesn't demand obedience. That strength isn't about crushing the weak. That maybe, her voice cracked slightly, maybe being German doesn't have to mean being a monster. One of the handlers raised his rifle, aiming at Greta. Werner grabbed the barrel, forcing it down. Don't, he hissed. If she falls, the box falls with her. Marcel tried to rise, his vision swimming from blood loss, but managed only to prop himself against a rock. Through the pain, he saw the calculation in Werner's eyes, the cold mathematics of someone weighing assets against objectives, the soulless arithmetic of a boy who'd been taught to value ideology over humanity. Greta, Werner said, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for warmth. You're my sister, my blood. Nothing matters more than family. Family? Greta's laugh was bitter, ancient beyond her years. When the Russians came to Berlin, when everything was burning, do you remember what you did, Werner? His face went rigid. You locked me in the cellar, Greta continued, tears streaming now. You and Mama. You said I was too slow, too weak to make the journey. You took your precious files and your money, and you left me to die. Her voice broke. The only reason I survived was because the building collapsed in a way that created an air pocket. I was trapped there for 3 days, Werner. 3 days in the dark with the dead, waiting for family that never came back. The words hit Werner like bullets. His face drained of color. That's not... We were going to come back. You weren't. The certainty in Greta's voice was absolute. I heard you arguing with Mama. You said I was expendable, that the documents mattered more than one weak child, that Papa would understand sacrificing me for the greater cause. One of the handlers spoke urgently in German. Werner, we don't have time for this. More French authorities could arrive. Shut up, Werner snapped. He took a step toward Greta, his hands spread in supplication. Greta, please. I was 15. I was scared. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Greta's voice was steel wrapped in sorrow. The same choice you're making now. Valuing things over people, ideology over love, the Reich over everything human and decent. She looked at the music box in her hands. This is what you really want. Not me, never me. And then she did something that changed everything. She opened the box, let the delicate mechanism play one last time. Mozart's Queen of the Night, that crystalline melody floating across the mountain darkness, and then carefully removed the false bottom. Diamonds spilled into her palm, catching starlight like captured stars. Dozens of them, each one worth a fortune, together representing the financial foundation of the network's future. Take them, she said, holding out her hand to Werner. Take Papa's precious stones. Buy your hideouts. Fund your operations. Rebuild your poisonous dream. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But you'll do it without me. She threw the diamonds at Werner's feet. They scattered across the frozen ground like seeds that would never grow. And in that moment, everyone moved at once. Werner lunged for the stones. His handlers rushed forward. Marcel forced himself upright, reaching for his fallen pistol. And Greta threw the empty music box over the cliff. It tumbled through darkness, the melody dying as it fell, the painted blue flowers disappearing into the abyss. And with it went the names, the addresses, the carefully documented network of contacts that Werner's handlers needed more than gold. No! Werner's scream echoed across the valley. One of the handlers grabbed Greta, but she'd expected it, had planned for it. She went limp, becoming dead weight, and as the man stumbled backward on the icy path, she twisted free and ran, not toward Marcel, but deeper into the mountains, toward the monastery lights visible in the next valley. After her! Werner shouted, but his handlers were scrambling for diamonds in the darkness, their careful professionalism crumbling into greed. The financial resources mattered more than the girl now that the girl had destroyed the information. They could always find another symbol, another heir. But diamonds were power. Marcel raised Mathieu's pistol, his hand shaking from blood loss, and fired into the air. The shot echoed like thunder, and suddenly everyone froze as new lights appeared on the mountainside below. Police. Military. The sergeant had sent reinforcements after all, had decided that 6 hours wasn't enough, that some battles required the law to actually enforce justice. Werner looked at Marcel, at his handlers fighting over stones, at the approaching lights, and Marcel saw the moment the boy realized he'd lost. Not just the girl, not just the network's future, but something more fundamental, the certainty that his cause was righteous, that his actions had meaning. She'll never be one of you, Werner said, venom in his voice. The blood runs true. Someday she'll remember what she is. She already does, Marcel replied. That's why she chose to walk away. Werner and his handlers melted into the darkness like smoke, leaving behind only scattered diamonds and the echo of their defeat. Marcel heard them crashing through the underbrush, heard shouted orders in German growing fainter, and knew the spider's web had just lost its most valuable thread. The police reached him minutes later, the sergeant from the roadblock leading the way. Beaumont, you're hit. The girl, Marcel gasped. She ran toward the monastery. You have to. We have men going that direction. She'll be safe. The sergeant applied pressure to Marcel's wound. You did good, mon ami. The documents you gave me, I got them to someone at Allied Command. They're already moving on the network. Arrests in Switzerland, Italy, even Argentina. And Greta? We'll need someone to care for her. Someone who actually loves her. The sergeant smiled grimly. I imagine that adoption petition might suddenly find approval once we clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding about kidnapping. Marcel let himself be lifted onto a stretcher, let the mountains swim away into darkness. His last thought before unconsciousness claimed him was of Greta, running toward light instead of shadow, choosing hope over heritage. He woke 3 days later in a military hospital in Lyon. Claire was beside his bed, her face exhausted but smiling. She's safe, Claire said before he could ask. Father Sebastian has her at the monastery. She's been asking for you every hour. And Werner? Gone. Vanished into whatever holes these rats hide in. But without the network's financial records and contact information, they're crippled. The sergeant says they're just scattered individuals now, not an organization. Marcel closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a wave. The music box? Destroyed. Greta said it was the only way to be sure. She threw away a fortune to save you, Marcel. She threw away a curse, he corrected, to save herself. The adoption was approved in late April of 1946, on a morning when spring flowers finally pushed through the soil and the world seemed to be remembering how to grow things instead of destroying them. Marcel signed the papers with his arm still in a sling, and Greta signed her name in careful letters. Greta Beaumont. They moved to Marseille, to a small apartment near the sea where the sound of waves replaced the memory of gunfire. Marcel returned to teaching, and Greta attended school, where she was simply another child learning arithmetic and geography, no one's symbol, no one's asset. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, Marcel would find her at the window, staring north toward the mountains, and he knew she was thinking of Werner. The brother who'd abandoned her, who'd chosen ideology over love, who existed somewhere in the shadows, still believing his cause was just. Do you think he'll come back? She asked once. Perhaps, Marcel said honestly. Hate has a long memory. Then we'll be ready. She took his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong, still together. On her 8th birthday, Greta asked for music lessons. Not German opera, but French folk songs. The kind Marie had sung. The kind that spoke of ordinary life and simple joys. She learned to play the piano, and sometimes in the evening, she'd perform for Marcel and Claire. Her music filling their home with beauty that demanded nothing, that simply existed as grace. The nightmares faded slowly, replaced by dreams of the future. She spoke of becoming a teacher like Papa Marcel, of helping other children who'd lost their way, of building something better from the ruins of what had been. And Marcel, watching her grow into someone kind and strong and whole, understood that salvation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing, every day, to write a different future. The diamonds Werner had scrambled to collect that night on the mountain. The sergeant later told Marcel they'd been recovered and returned to their rightful owners. Jewish families whose wealth had been stolen, survivors who could finally rebuild. Even the stones, it seemed, had found their way toward justice. Years later, when Greta was grown and had children of her own, someone would ask her about the music box, about the brother who'd tried to reclaim her for a dying Reich, about the night she'd stood at a cliff's edge and chosen freedom. She would smile, that same fragile smile Marcel had first seen in the ruins, and say only, "Some chains are made of gold, but they're still chains, and I chose to break mine." As for Werner Vogel, he was never found. The network he'd represented collapsed into isolated cells, their grand visions of a Fourth Reich, crumbling into bitter obscurity. But sometimes, in the decades that followed, there would be reports. A gray-eyed man in Buenos Aires, asking questions about a girl who disappeared. A figure at a Paris cafe, watching a family that resembled his lost sister. Sightings that were never confirmed, shadows that might have been memory more than substance. Some say he's still searching, still believing, still waiting for the sister who threw away his empire and never looked back. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make and the legacies we leave behind, I'd be honored if you'd share it. Hit that subscribe button for more stories of courage in dark times, and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Marcel's position? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is save one small life from the machinery of history. Until next time, remember, love is always the harder choice, and that's exactly what makes it worth choosing. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses